All right, so we are in the sea of redemption still, and last week we started talking about the flood. And I think the last thing we talked about is how in Genesis chapter 6 and in verse 14, when God is telling Noah, I think I almost said Moses. I don't know if I said Moses before. We're talking about Noah, not Moses. Okay, God told Noah, make this ark out of gopher wood. You're going to make it do all these things. And the word that is used there for cover it inside and outside with pitch is the same verb in Hebrew for make atonement. And I think that's really going to be significant because atonement is so important as we go forward. To cover the sins of mankind is what we think of when we think of atonement. And here God is telling him, cover this ark with this pitch. And we know that through the ark, God is going to deliver Moses, I did it, there it is, Noah and his family. And one reason why Moses is on my brain, because whenever we get there, there's going to be a basket that's covered and he's delivered in the water. Okay, anyway, but Noah, that's who we're talking about now. We're talking about Noah. And that's what we were talking about last time. And so God says he's going to send rain on the earth, which had never happened before. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, it says that the water kind of came from the ground and supplied the water for everything. So this never happened before. God sent the rain for 40 days. Water was on the earth 150 days. And God pronounced judgment on every single person and all of the animals on the earth, except for the 8 people in the ark and the animals that were in the ark. And so, as we were talking about before, the sin had increased to a point where God was, I'm trying to think of what the word was now. God was, let's see. Chapter 6, in verse 7, he says, I'm sorry that I've made them. But in verse 6, he says he was grieved in his heart. Your version might actually say heartbroken. The sin had increased to a point where God's justice could not tolerate it anymore. But even in God's righteous justice in destroying people and the animals and saying, I'm going to start over, he saves these 8 people. And it's really because of the righteousness that we're going to see from Noah. And so what we might be thinking here is, okay, is this it? Have we gotten back to the garden? As we've been talking about throughout this thing, we're all trying to get back to the garden. Is this it? Have we made it back? I mean, sin's been obliterated, right? All the sinners and the animals even, they've been obliterated. And so have we made it back? Is this finally what it's supposed to be? If you look in, let's see, go to Genesis 8, please. Genesis 8. And look at verses 20 through 22. Genesis chapter 8. So after the flood, I'm sure a lot of us know the story. I'm not getting into a lot of the details because I'm trying to see the overarching themes here. In Genesis chapter 8, verse 20, after they're on land, this is what Noah does. Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. The Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And I will never again destroy every living thing as I've done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And I love that. And chapter 9, verse 1, God blessed Noah and his sons, said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. I mean, right there, what does that sound like? Have we seen that before? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Those are the instructions in the garden to Adam and Eve. This is what I want you to do. So, okay, have we made it? Have we made it back? Look at verse 2. The fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the sky, with everything that creeps on the ground, all the fish of the sea, into your hand they are given. Every moving thing that's alive will be food for you. I give all to you as I gave the green plant. And we'll talk about verse 4 just for a minute here. And so these are things that bring to remembrance the garden. So have we made it? I mean, are we back? Are we good? Have we made it back to the garden? And unfortunately, we're going to see that that's not the case, because in Genesis 9, and really we see throughout the end of chapter 9, where Noah plants this vineyard and he gets drunk and his son sees his nakedness. And I don't know all of the details exactly what all these things mean, but in some way that he could have and should have avoided, his son saw his nakedness and was trying to tell his brothers, hey, you got to check this out. This is crazy. And that was just shameful. And so I think that's really important. We're going to see this throughout the book of Genesis even, is here is God has wiped out the sin of mankind. So mankind's gone, except for these 8 people because of the faith of Noah. He has wiped out even the animals and cleansed the earth with this water. So if there was ever, it seems like, okay, here's the solution. Here it is. We're good. We're back to the garden. Noah wasn't the answer. Noah needed redemption just like any other human ever. So he would be looking forward to the redemption that's going to come from Jesus. And we see here that even Noah, this righteous man in the midst of this terrible, I want to say crooked and perverse generation, that's the wordage that's hitting me right now, in this generation where every thought and intention of their hearts were evil continually, even this righteous man, he's not the answer. He still had sin in his life and he still needed redemption just like any other man. Okay, any thoughts on that? Anybody? Okay. All right. And so I think that's really important. We see God in his blessings, he establishes a covenant with Noah, his family, and he says, I will never again destroy the earth like this. And so that's why we have the rainbow in the sky, and I love that. And we can't let people steal our rainbow. The rainbow is too good and too important for that. Okay, so I think it's really important that we do see this, though, that Noah was not the answer. We're going to see more of this as we go throughout Genesis. Noah's descendants, they increased, they moved to the land of Shinar. But before we do that, I just want us to think about the overarching theme of the flood and what God did in the flood, what he did for Noah in the flood. If we look at 1 Peter chapter 3, 1 Peter chapter 3, and if we go down to verses 20 and 21, really, if we start in verse 18, 1 Peter chapter 3, start in verse 18, please. So 1 Peter 3:18, for Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which also he went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison, who once were disobedient, when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who's at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven after angels and authorities and powers had been subjected to him. And so as we're thinking about Noah and the ark and how God delivers the few through the water, I mean, like he delivers them through this water. It wasn't because Noah built this boat. It wasn't because he was so good. It's because God told him what to do and told him when this stuff was going to happen. And God saved Noah and his family through the water. And I mean, it's right there. Corresponding to this now, baptism saves us. And it's not us getting dunked in water or us doing the work that saves us. It's God delivering us through the water. And so that's just exactly what that is. Any thoughts on this? Yes, sir?
I was going to say that the flood seems to stand in history as a marker for that God has to deal with sin. That's the first big marker we have. I know we can't name, but that's a thinking the point of the flood. God has to deal with sin. He has to punish sin.
He has to, in his justice, he has to. I love that. Yeah. So he said the flood seems like in history to be the big marker that God has to deal with sin, that his justice requires that he deals with sin, and he does. So absolutely. Any other thoughts on this so far, the flood, or what we saw leading up to it, or how baptism relates to that now? And that's only because we're baptized in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. It's not about the water. There's some song, I think there must have been something in the water. It's like, let's get rid of that. It's not what it's about. Any thoughts on this? Okay, well, back in Genesis, we see where Noah's descendants, they moved to the land of Shinar, which if you see land of Shinar anywhere in the scriptures, be thinking Babylon, because that's what it's going to be. And almost any time you see that, that's not a good thing. Just like a lot of times when Egypt shows up, that's not a very good thing. So Noah's descendants, they increased, they moved to the land of Shinar. And if you remember in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28, and you remember what we just read this morning in chapter 9, verse 1, what did God tell mankind in the garden to do and then tell Noah and his family to do? Yes, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That's what God wants man to do, is fill the earth. But we're going to see very quickly, there's a choice that mankind has, just like in the garden. You can choose to have faith and follow what God says, or you can choose your own way, and it's not going to work out the way that we think it will. And we all fall for this as well. But in Genesis chapter 11, we read about the Tower of Babel. I say Babel. Some people say Babel. I don't know. Babel, I'm going to say Babel. The Tower of Babel. And look at, let's see, chapter 11 and verse 4. And notice, I think it's so important. I've read this passage, I don't know how many times, but never noticed this before. In chapter 11, verse 4, they were saying, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." Isn't that so interesting? Like the thing that they didn't want to happen is specifically what God in the garden said he wanted mankind to do. And after the flood to Noah is specifically what he said, "I want you to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth." And they're saying, let's make this big old tower and then we won't have to be scattered everywhere. And so they're choosing their own way. This is the garden. This is not choosing faith in God and doing what he says and choosing your own way, which leads to some bad consequences here. And so because of this, God confused their language into multiple languages so that they would separate, so that they would fill the earth as God originally told them. And that's what he wanted for them to do. And we get all the way down where the descendants of Shem lead us to a man named Abram and a woman named Sarai. But before we get to those people, because we're going to have to spend some time on them, it's so important. Any thoughts on Tower of Babel or mankind choosing their own way? Anything?
Well,
Sorry.
that was group sufficiency
Mm.
rather than God dependence.
Yeah, group sufficiency rather than God dependence is what he said. Yeah, I like that. Sir?
You mentioned that this is all to the east. We talked about that in some of your previous lessons. And I mentioned before about the ancient Chinese alphabet language, that it's built on symbols. All of their stuff points to the west. And that's because the Tower of Babel is west of China. So the people that migrated to the east after Babel and eventually settled in China, their alphabet, their language was built on the idea of all these events that occurred in the West.
Huh. That's fascinating. I've never heard that before. That is so cool. It almost makes me wish that I knew some Chinese. That's pretty cool. That's awesome. Any other comments? Any other thoughts? Land of Shinar, Babel, anything? Okay, well, let's keep going here. And we've got to talk about Abram and Abraham's role in redemption. This, I don't know, this might be a hot take. You tell me. It can be overstated. It can be, but it's also, I think it's going to be hard for us to reach that point where it can be overstated. And because in Romans chapter 4, Abraham is called the father of all who believe, I think it's really important that we spend some time here. There's so many things in the New Testament that we really can't understand or fully grasp unless we see what was happening in the Old Testament around Abraham, all this stuff. I don't remember what this next slide looks like. What's it look? Okay, cool. Abraham's role in redemption. That looks pretty good. That's supposed to be more than just Abraham, by the way. There's several people. In my mind, I think AIJJ, and that helps me remember the end of what happens in Genesis. But when we talk about Abram, we're in Genesis chapter 11, and in verses 31 through 32, we see Terah, who is Abram's father, takes Abram, Sarai, and Lot, and he's actually going on the way to the land of Canaan, which is interesting. And he gets as far as Haran and he passes away. But in chapter 12, we see where God talks to Abram. And these things in the scheme of redemption, this is part where I don't think it can be overstated. In the scheme of redemption, God uses Abraham, and look at chapter 12, please. Chapter 12, look at the first 3 verses. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." And it seems like God makes 3 promises to Abram, and we're going to have to connect because these promises are repeated different times. And we're going to have to connect some of those different times that these promises are made just to make sure that we understand the full depth of what is being promised to Abram, usually people say land, nation, and all nations will be blessed. Those are the three. There's actually more than three than just that, but those are the main three ones that we need to focus on. Land, nation, and all nations will be blessed. Do I have something on that? Okay, cool. All right. Man, I like these PowerPoints. Okay, so land, nation, or that's actually nation, land, and then all people of the earth will be blessed. And we'll talk about how those connections are made. Do I have a label on there? All right, great. All right. These things are good. I don't remember what I put on my PowerPoints. Okay, so nation, land, and seed. Those are the promises that God makes to Abram. One of the things that's so interesting to me is this seems very much like the creation in the Genesis narrative, because God creates man, and man has done nothing to deserve all of the good things that God does for him. Put in the perfect place, perfect fellowship, all this. He's just a handful of dust, and Eve is a rib. And mankind's done nothing to deserve this. Up to chapter 12, other than seeing his name a couple of times, we don't really know anything about Abram. And then God just tells him, and he says, you know what? I'm going to promise these things to you. I mean, if that's not a picture of grace, I don't know what is. We don't know anything about Abram here. We're going to see in Hebrews 11, there's so much good stuff about him and his faith and his belief, just all that. But as we're reading through this, we really don't know much about him, other than he comes from a relatively righteous line, and that's a great thing. And so God's grace is on display. And from the beginning, God has always required his people to respond to his grace in faith. And so God tells him, go forth from your country, go from your relatives, go from your father's house to the land which I'll show you. And if you do those things, then I promise you these things. So how is Abram going to respond to this is the question. Is this going to be like the garden where God said, do these things and don't do this one thing, and I will just bless you, keep on blessing you, but mankind chooses his own way? And thankfully here we see that that's not what Abram does. He listens and he has faith, and I love that. It's really important. So as we're looking at these promises that are made, let's see, look at Genesis 22, please. 22, just for a minute, because the seed promise, it's kind of hard, I think, to see the direct relationship with the seed promise, sometimes in the wordage of chapter 12. But in Genesis 22, when God repeats these promises to Abram, let's notice what he says in verse 18. Actually, let's start in verse 15, just so we can see all of it. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed, all of the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. That's where we see, really the word seed, that's so important as we get to the New Testament, because there's just no question about what this is. And so when we're in Genesis chapter 12, when God is telling him, where is it? Let's see. Make your name great. You'll be a blessing. Bless those who bless you. In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. In that, I think we talked about Genesis 3:15, because that's so important. I think that's the first gospel sermon. It's not the first gospel sermon under the new covenant, but that's the first gospel sermon, talking about how the seed that would come from the woman would be at enmity with the seed of the serpent, and how he would crush his head and get snapped on the heel, or whatever language you want to use there. That was the first gospel sermon. But here we see, in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And take a look at Galatians chapter 3, please. We don't have to guess this at all. We know exactly who this is talking about. Galatians chapter 3. And go down to verse 8, please. Galatians chapter 3, look at verse 8. This is also why I love that this is the second gospel sermon, not under the new covenant, but it's the second gospel sermon, because we're going to see it right here. Galatians chapter 3, verse 8. The scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham. That's so cool. Saying, all the nations will be blessed in you. So then, those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham the believer. It's right there. We don't even have to guess this. I don't even have to go out on a limb to say this is a gospel sermon, because here it is right here. God preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham by saying all the nations will be blessed in you. Okay, you're still in Galatians. Look at verse 16. Galatians 3, look down at verse 16. Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say, and to seeds, as referring to many, but rather to one, and to your seed. And explicitly, what are the last three words? That is Christ. So we know that this seed promise, I mean, it can't even be any more clear than this, right? The seed, singular, not plural, is Jesus. It's Christ. And that's what the fulfillment of these promises would be. And that's why we get these overarching arches. Can I say that? Overarching arches? I don't know, these lines here that connect what's happening all the way in Genesis chapter 12 to what happens in the New Testament. And as we've talked about from the beginning, this is the eternal plan before anything or anyone was ever created. This was always the plan. This was always going to happen. I love that. So cool. And so as we're looking back at the problem of sin in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, everything was perfect, perfect fellowship, perfect relationship with God. Genesis 3:6, when mankind chooses their own way, ruins it. Right away, Genesis 3:15, we get the first gospel sermon talking about the seed of woman that we know is Jesus. And now we connect that with the seed of Abraham that we know is Christ, because it's explicitly told to us, and we're connecting that. The solution to the problem of Genesis 3:6 is going to be the seed of Abraham. Somebody have a, ma'am? Mm-hmm. That's a great question. It really could be both. I think immediately, the immediate fulfillment is the nation that is going to be born from his physical lineage. But as we get to, I mean, Romans and we get to Hebrews and some of the stuff we're going to look at, it really could be everybody who's a Christian, who, as we mentioned, Romans 4 talks about how Abraham is the father of all who believe. So yeah.
You know, as human beings, we're not, our science is not able to find the end of the universe, right? And all the stars that are out there, and that number is it's enormous.
Yeah.
That's not even the right word to really describe it, and that's beautiful to think about all of it. So.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll get to that too as we go through Abram's life, because I think we have to go through his life. It's so important. Yeah. Anything else on that? Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts or anything so far?
That's being referred to as adopted into the family of Abraham, because it's not God making a second promise saying, yeah, I promised the seed of Abraham, but oh, I'll give it to you guys too. He actually first makes us children of Abraham, which goes back to what you said, all who believe, you know, Abraham is our father. So we really are. It's not like, oh, we're not descendants of Abraham. Yes, we are. And I think in our culture, we really have an advantage. We should be able to understand that better than anybody, because there's some cultures that kind of view adoption kind of funny, like you got your real kids, you got your adopted kids. But I think in a modern American society, we've really come to embrace the idea that an adopted child really is your child. And the same thing applies to us. We've been adopted into the family of Abraham. So we're not redheaded stepchildren. We really are children of Abraham.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you said redheaded stepchildren, because I was thinking that and I was like, man, that's going to bring out the Barron County in me real fast. But yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And as we talk about the faith of Abram that we're going to see, and as we talk about what that means for us, I love that you said that. It's such a great point. Okay. Any other thoughts, sir?
Here, Genesis 22 clearly is speaking in the plural. He said, I multiply your seed. And yet Paul references that in Galatians 3 and says it's singular. And the thing that comes to mind, and I think Paul is emphasizing, is the fact that the body of Christ is united one. That it is not, we are many. I mean, it was a problem that existed in Galatia, there's a problem that existed in Corinth, and a number of churches where they saw their diversity and thought of themselves as being different from one another. Where I think Paul is emphasizing that in Christ, you are one.
Mm.
We are one body. And he is our blessing if we are in him. That's the way he begins the letter he wrote to the church in Ephesus. That very long sentence that starts in verse 3 of chapter 1 about how everything is in Christ.
Mhm.
All the spiritual blessings are in Christ.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I hope that maybe one of these classes, I'll take all of these arching lines and we're just going to notice that really all of them connect to Jesus. They all either go forward to him or back. So it's all about being in him. Even before the foundation of the world, they knew the fulfillment was in him. Absolutely. Okay. Any other thoughts really quick? Okay, cool. So just think about the overarching themes that we're seeing in Genesis so far, where God provides his grace to people. He requires that they respond to him in faith, and mankind has a choice which direction to go. And we see Abram here, he listens. And in chapter 12, verses 7 he listens and he takes Sarai, he takes Lot, they head toward Canaan. And notice verses 7 and 8. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. So here so far in Genesis, when people call on the name of the Lord, it's a big deal because that's typically thought of as building altars. And it was through the line of Seth that it said people began to call on the name of the Lord in these days. It's a really big deal. So Abram responds to God's grace in faith. He believes God. He does this. He gives reverence to God here. And that's so unbelievably important. And so as we're thinking about the book of Genesis, have we made it? Have we gotten back to the garden? You know, it seems like, okay, God made a covenant with these people and Abraham's responding the right way. So have we made it back? This sounds really, really good. Well, unfortunately, no. Because in the scheme of redemption, not even Abram is the solution. Not even Abram is completely blameless, because what does he do right after this? In Genesis 12, verses 10 through 20, there's a famine in the land, so they go down to Egypt. And Abram deceives Pharaoh and says that his wife is his sister. Now, we can talk about the biology and how, well, it wasn't actually a lie, but there was deception. There was absolutely deception involved here. And it's not explicitly stated that this is wrong, but what's interesting is this pagan ruler, this Pharaoh, let's see, look down at verse 18. Notice this Pharaoh rebukes Abram in verse 18. "What is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here's your wife. Take her and go." Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they escorted him away with his wife and all that belonged to him. So we've just seen this amazing demonstration of Abram's faith. But right after that, there's a physical famine in the land, and Abram goes to Egypt, which, where did God just tell him to go? To the land of Canaan. He said, "I'm going to give this to you." And I don't know. We don't know specifically what would have happened here if he just stayed where God told him to go. We don't know. But it seems like Abraham, the people, this is the dude, right? Abram sees this physical famine, goes to get help where he thinks he should go get help. And there he deceives the Pharaoh. His precious wife becomes the wife of a pagan ruler. And that just shows us that in this whole scheme of redemption, Abram's not the answer. Abram had sin in his life. Abram needed the redemption that was going to come through his seed just as much as every other human on the planet. And that's big. I think that's huge. And this also shows us that it's not perfect law keeping that God requires. Because if we're going to read all the things about Abram's faith and Abram's, how he's the father of all those who believe, we also have to point out that he had some flaws. I love that. Okay, any thoughts on that before we keep going? I don't love his flaws. That's not what I meant, by the way. I don't know if I said that appropriately or not. Okay. The father of all who believe. Also, I meant to say this in James 2:23, Abraham is called the friend of God. So even though Abram had sin in his life, this is absolutely deception. A pagan ruler rebuked him. He's called the friend of God. So perfect law keeping ain't it. We say that. It's about faith. It's about faith in God. Okay. let's see where we want to go from here. In Genesis chapter 13, some stuff that we have to talk about in Genesis 13. Abram and Lot, they part ways because they're both extremely wealthy, and they had big flocks and herds. And Abram settled in the land of Canaan. In Genesis 13, let's read this, verses 14 through 18. This is a recounting of the promises that God has for Abram and his line. Look at Genesis 13, verse 14. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are. Let's see. Yeah, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So I think this shows us what faith really looks like. It's not that you're sinless. It's not that you're perfect. But here, after Abram and Lot, they part ways. They're both extremely wealthy. God has told Abraham, recounts these promises to him. And Abram moves his tent, dwells by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and he builds an altar there to the Lord. He shows his reverence. He shows his faith. He shows his trust in who God is. Even though he's not perfect, he's got faith, and he trusts God. He believes God. And that's a really wonderful thing in chapter 13. Any thoughts on that one before we keep going? Okay, sir.
The altar building is fine if there's something.
Mm.
Altar represents.
Altar represents atonement for sin. Yeah, that's great. Anybody else? Any thoughts? Life of Abram. It's really weird to say Abram for me because we always refer to him as Abraham, but here his name is still Abram at this point. Okay, so in Genesis 14, what happens is there's all these kings, Chedorlaomer is one of them, and Lot and his family get taken captive, and they're taking these people away. Abram hears about this. He rallies up his allies, and Abram goes out and conquers these people, takes all their spoil, rescues his family. Instead of taking the spoil for himself, we're going to see that he actually gives it to these other kings, and he says, let the people, they take what they want, but I don't need any of that. But we're going to meet a man who's really important as we get to the book of Hebrews, really important, a man named Melchizedek. Melchizedek shows up. Look at verse 17 starting. Then after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and all the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh. That was weird. I've never seen that before. I'm just kidding. Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. Now, this is super weird in Genesis. I mean, there's no written law. We haven't seen anything about who can be priests. We've never, not that I can remember, we've never really seen a king of Salem before. I mean, this is really weird. This is really unique as we get here. But the king of Salem, this would have been Jerusalem. The king of Salem, Jerusalem. Melchizedek meets Abram in the King's Valley, and it says Melchizedek was also a priest of God Most High. I mean, that's a really strange title to me for someone who lived, just think about the numbers here, about 500 years before the actual Jewish law was given. Don't you think that's interesting? But here's this king priest of Jerusalem. He's the king priest of the city of peace. The king priest of the city of peace, Jerusalem. It's really interesting to me. Let's see. In Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, the Messiah is called the Prince of Peace. So we see Melchizedek is a type or a shadow of who Jesus is, the Redeemer. We don't have to guess or make this up because Hebrews chapter 7, I mean, it is loaded with so much good stuff about Melchizedek and his relationship to Abram and then Jesus. And the writer of Hebrews explains in Hebrews chapter 7 that the superior one was blessing the inferior one. So we see, as if we keep reading here, look at verse 19. He, Melchizedek, blessed him, Abram, and said, blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessors of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of all. So Melchizedek blesses Abram by God Most High. And the writer of Hebrews says that the superior one was blessing the inferior one. And if we're just thinking about how much the scriptures talk about Abraham, You would think Abraham would be the superior one, would you not? But the writer of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 7, says the superior one blessed the inferior one. So this king priest of Jerusalem, the king priest of the city of peace, blesses Abram, and some way he's the superior one. But Hebrews 7 just nails it down that Jesus is a priest from the line of Melchizedek because he wasn't a Levite. Yes, sir.
I don't know that we can overstate how significant it is that a man would be both a king and a priest. There's only 3 examples in history within God's line where a king was also a priest, and of course Melchizedek is the first, the foreshadowing of that. In the book of Zechariah, we read where Joshua, the high priest, in an image or a symbol, has a crown put on his head, and that's foreshadowing for something in the future. And of course, even his name, Joshua, in Hebrew is the name Jesus in Greek. And Jesus is the fulfillment of that, of a king and priest.
Mm-hmm.
There's 2 examples of kings who tried to become priests. Saul, who forced himself off of the sacrifice, and because of that, he lost the kingdom. And then Uzziah, who was a righteous king of Judah, until he went into the temple and was struck with leprosy because he did so. And so God made a very clear distinction between these 2 roles with these 3 exceptions that are so very unique.
Yeah. I love you said unique. They are so unique. And then we don't have to guess that it connects directly to Jesus. So thank you so much for that. But Hebrews chapter 7 just makes it so clear. And so how Melchizedek was superior to Abram. I mean, the guy that we think is the father of all who believe, which is told to us. And the writer of Hebrews says that Jesus is superior to the Levitical priesthood. He's superior to those things. It's a much better way. Read Hebrews 7 today if you get a chance, because it'll be worth your time thinking about Melchizedek for sure. And in him, in all of this, as great as Abraham was, he is not the solution to sin, but it's the one who's going to come from his line that is the solution to sin. And Hebrews, let's look at Hebrews chapter 7, verse 11, actually. Let's just look at this. Make sure that I'm not just making something up. Let's see it together. Let's see, Hebrews chapter 7, please. And actually look at verse 7. So this whole lesser being blessed by the greater, that's where this comes from. Look at verse 7. Without any dispute, I love that. Without any dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater. In this case, mortal men receive tithes, but in that case, one receives them of whom it is witnessed that he lives on. And so to speak, through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes, paid tithes, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. But man, there's so much good stuff we could talk about there. But talking about the superior being blessed, or I'm sorry, the superior blessing the inferior. Look down at verse 11, please. Now, if perfection was through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it, the people received the law, what further need was there for another priest to arise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be designated according to the order of Aaron? Okay, so that's really interesting. That's talking about how Jesus is better he's a priest under the order of Melchizedek and not under the Levitical priesthood. Look down at verse 23, please. Verse 23. The former priests, on the one hand, existed in greater numbers because they were prevented by death from continuing. But Jesus, on the other hand, because he continues forever, holds his priesthood permanently. Therefore, he is able to save forever those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was fitting for us to have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens, who does not need daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins, and then for the sins of the people, because this he did once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son made perfect forever. And so the point of Hebrews chapter 7 is that Jesus is better than the system of the old law, and Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek, and he is the only, I love this, he's the only one that can once for all time be the perfect sacrifice and perfect high priest. And so as we're looking at the life of Abram and Abraham, and we're going to talk about his tremendous faith, the wonderful things that God did for him and through him, Abram's not the solution. Jesus is. And even Abram was looking forward to the fulfillment of all these things in Jesus. Okay, any thoughts before we keep going? And we could just keep talking about that for a long time. Sir? Hmm. 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 Yeah, absolutely. I love that you said that. Basically, how there's so much that we don't know in the scriptures and how God was working in other people's lives. And the things that we have written are written for the specific purpose of us seeing the scheme of redemption and how that comes to fruition. But there's other things that God's doing in the world that we don't have written down. And like a lot of people will sometimes say like, oh man, we're in trouble. Everybody hold on. I'm just kidding. We're not. But some people will say the Jews were the only people that God reached out to. And that's just not the case because we have prophets in the scriptures that go specifically to non-Jews talking about God. And there are prophets that are written about, but we don't have their writings, and they went to people who were not Jews. And so there's all these other things that God's doing in the world that we don't even have revealed to us, but this is revealed to us for this very specific purpose. Yeah, and sometimes I'm like, man, I'd love to know what was going on. That would be great, but we just can't for now anyway. Okay, any other thoughts or anything so far? Okay. All right, so we talked about Melchizedek. He's so unbelievably important as we think about Jesus. After these things in Genesis 15, 2 through 3, notice that Abram is getting, it seems like he's getting kind of worried. I don't want to say that he's lost his faith because that's certainly not going to be the case as we see in the New Testament. But in Genesis 15, look at verses, let's start in verse 1 actually. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision saying, do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward will be very great. Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, since you've given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir. Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. And so it seems like Abram is asking this really this is a fair question, I think. God has promised him and repeated a couple of times that through his lineage, his nation would be huge. His nation? Yeah, his lineage would be huge. They'd become a nation. He promised them land. And he said, through your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And here's Abram after all these events and everything that's gone on. And he's going, God, how are you going to fulfill this? I don't have any children. That's a fair question to ask, right? Don't you think? Everybody's going to be blessed through my seed, and I'm going to have more descendants than the sand or the dust on the earth, as we read earlier. And so he's like, I don't have any children. And right now my heir is this Eliezer of Damascus. So what's going on? And God answers him and he says, it's going to be someone from your body, and this is going to happen. And let's look at let's see, we could read verses 8 through 21, but this is where God is repeating the promises that he's making here. And really, God tells him exactly what's going to happen through to the fourth generation. We just got to read it. Yes, sir.
Verse 6, it forms the foundation of so many different statements in the New Testament that interestingly are applied to different events in the life of Abraham. And yet they all quote this one verse to make the point about how that Abraham's faith is what God called righteousness. And he calls that righteousness for us today in exactly the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to come back to that in just a second too. Look at verse 8. O Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it? So he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. Then he brought all these to him and cut them in two, laid each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. The birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. I mean, he's telling him this before any of this even happens. Verse 14, I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they'll come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. It came about when the sun had set that it was very dark. And behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants, I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite and the Kenizzite and the Cadmonite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Rephaim and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Girgashite and the Jebusite. Wonderful. Good stuff. Man, where do I even want to start with this? There's so much good stuff. If you've ever heard the phrase cut the covenant, this is what we're talking about. Covenants were made by cutting these animals from snout to rump and laying them on two sides, and they would walk in between them as a sign saying, okay, these are the two halves of this covenant. We both got a role to play in this, and if I don't keep up my side, then I'm going to be dead like these animals. That's how their covenants worked. Oh, man, we're going to talk more about this next time. Appreciate you all.